Hey everybody, it's Uncle Chad testing out some new lights here at the Fitz Radio booth. Got some catching up to do. Elena's coming home this weekend. Julia's leaving on Thursday. Addie and I are staying here, and we are going to try and get a little bit caught up on Hatchet here. But first, you may notice Cory's not here. Well, we're going to go on a little bit of a tour outside the Fitz Radio booth so you guys can see around a little bit, and we're going to go see where Cory sleeps. Cory's got a crib. Cory's crib. He's corn, ear corn. He's got a little crib that I built for him that sits next to my desk. Weird, yeah, probably, but it's not, at this point, if you think that's weird, then whatever. So, Hatchet. We have 6 chapters left, and these have been taking 25 minutes a piece. I've been trying to find time. I'm just pretty busy here in the middle of COVID, fall, second wave. It's great. That's really red, isn't it? Let's turn that down. See, I can do that. That's kind of a nice light. I like that light. It's kind of a yellow. Anyway, we've got about 6 chapters left, and I'm afraid that I'm probably going to end up, if I just did it the old way, we kept going, I'm not going to get caught up. So, and by the time Elena gets home, and we've got 5 days and 6 chapters. So what I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to let Cory sleep. We're going to go see him, and then I'll come back in here, and I'm going to knock out probably at least 2 chapters, maybe 3. So if you want to read along, and hopefully I'm not quite as distracted. I'm hoping. Trying to work on my reading out loud is hard. It's maybe an auditory thing. I really don't know, but it's just hard for me to read out. So anyway, let's go visit Cory. You guys like the new booth too, by the way? Yeah, I changed out the lights, so if I do this, see, it's just back to the way it was, but these lights are kind of cool because you can do different stuff with them. Versus the old disco light, which y'all are used to. Yeah, that's the way we'll leave it while we go mess with Cory. I will. I'm bringing my laser pointer, so that I'll outline him, so you'll be able to see him. So hold on a second. He's asleep. We gotta be pretty quiet. Okay. All right. So. Okay, just so you know. This is my, that is our utility sink and stuff. Fitz Radio. That's the outside of the booth. So, let's go find Cory. Oh, I see him. I see him. Can you see him? I should outline him. You can hear him. He's sleeping. You can see it. It's by my computer. Kind of see that's a little bit trippy, but it's dark. I don't want to wake him up. Okay, let's go back in the booth and read some Hatchet. Okay. He's such a little guy, you just don't want to you don't want to mess with him too much. You don't want to give him nightmares. Cory to be happy, right? Got so much knowledge. He's so smart. He's actually really, he's very positive. I like that. Helps me get through. Old Cory. Okay. Well, interesting. Huh. Yeah, just messing with the lights a little bit here, trying to get it straight. Okay. Let's turn on some better light, some reading light. That's a little nice. Is that too dark? Huh. Cool. Keep thinking like, why is it so dark? And it's just like, well, because you don't have any light on in here. And that's more normal. That's just the white light. Anyway, when we feel like partying around here, we will put on some fancy lights and make them flash and stuff, like at a discoteca over in Europe, right, Lily? Right, Ophelia? Marie, Nassim. And okay, Taro, you're also included in this as well, and other kids from around the place. So, okay, all right, we're on chapter 13 of Hatchet. So I hope you stayed with me here. I know it's been 6 minutes and 45 seconds of seeing Cory and whatnot and seeing the booth, but now I'm going to get into it. So I think I'm going to read probably chapter 13 and 14. And if I get real long-winded, maybe I'll go for a third. So we'll have to see here. Okay, maybe if I got halfway through, that would be pretty cool, right? And then we could get caught up. We got Huskers coming this weekend. Got Big Ten football back, which is sweet. Can't wait. But we kind of like to get Hatchet done before that. But if not, we'll read it. Even if Elena's here, I have to finish the book now. So anyway, off we go. So, all right, here we go. Brian stood at the end of the long part of the L of the lake and watched the water, smelled the water, listened to the water, was the water. A fish moved and his eyes jerked sideways to see the ripples, but he did not move any other part of his body and did not raise the bow or reach into his pelt pouch for a fish arrow. It was not the right kind of fish, not a food fish. The food fish stayed close in the shallows and did not roll that way but made quicker movements, food movements. The large fish rolled and stayed deep and could not be taken, but it didn't matter. This morning, he was not looking for fish. Fish was the light meat and he was sick of them. He was looking for one of the foolish birds. He called them foolish birds. And there was a flock that lived near the end of the long part of the lake, but something he did not understand had stopped him, and he stood, breathing gently through his mouth to keep silent, letting his eyes and ears go out and do the work for him. It had happened before this way. Something had come into him from outside to warn him, and he had stopped. Once it had been the bear again. He had been taking the last of the raspberries, and something came inside and stopped him. And when he looked where his ears said to look, there was a female bear with cubs. I want to make sure I don't get a stain on here. I put grease in my hair sometimes. No. We had a coach, a wrestling coach back in the day, Mr. Merrick. He was our 8th grade, like, geography teacher or something. And he had greasy hair, and he always put his head on the blackboard, and they would always it left a big spot on the board. It was gross. So I don't want to be like Mr. Merrick. He used to call him Chumley. He looked like Chumley, like a penguin, kind of. Anyway. He had taken 2 more steps. Had he taken 2 more steps, he would have come between the mother and her cubs, and that was a bad place to be. As it was, the mother had stood and faced him and made a sound, a low, sound in her throat to threaten and warn him. He paid attention to the feeling now, and he stood and waited patiently, knowing he was right and that something would come. Turn, smell, listen, feel, and then a sound, a small sound, and he looked up, and away from the lake he saw the wolf. It was halfway up the hill from the lake, standing with its head and shoulders sticking out into a small opening, looking down on him with wide yellow eyes. He had never seen a wolf, and the size threw him. Not as big as a bear, but somehow seeming that large. The wolf claimed all that was below him and his own, took Brian as his own. Brian looked back and forth for a moment, felt afraid because the wolf was so right. He knew Brian, knew him and owned him, and chose not to do anything to him. But the fear moved away, and Brian knew the wolf for what it was, another part of the woods, another part of it all. Brian relaxed the tension on the spear and in his hand, settled the bow in his other hand from where it had started to come up. He knew the wolf now, as the wolf knew him, and he nodded to it, nodded and smiled. The wolf watched him for another time, another part of his life, and then it turned and walked effortlessly up the hill. As it came out of the brush, it was followed by 3 other wolves, all equally large and gray and beautiful, all looking down on him as they trotted past and away, and Brian nodded to each of them. He was not the same now. The Brian that stood and watched the wolves move away and nodded to them was completely changed. Time had come. Time that he measured but didn't care about. Time had come into his life and moved out and left him different. It measured time. 47 days had passed since the crash. 42 days, he thought, since he had died and had been born as the new Brian. When the plane had come and gone, it had put him down, gutted him and dropped him and left him with nothing. The rest of that first day, he had gone down and down until dark. He had let the fire go out, had forgotten to eat even an egg, had let his brain take him down to where he was done, where he wanted to be done and done, to where he wanted to die. He had settled into the gray funk deeper and still deeper until finally, in the dark, he had gone up on the ridge and taken the hatchet and tried to end it by cutting himself. Madness, a hissing madness that took his brain. There had been nothing for him then, and he tried to become nothing, but the cutting had been hard to do, impossible to do, and he had at last fallen to his side, wishing for death, wishing for an end, and slept, only didn't sleep. With his eyes closed and his mind open, he lay on the rock through the night, lay and hated and wished for it to end, and thought the word cloud down through that awful night, over and over the word, wanting all his clouds to come down. But in the morning he was still there on the side, and the sun came up, and when he opened his eyes, he saw the cuts on his arm, the dry blood turning black. He saw the blood and hated the blood, hated what he had done to himself when he was the old Brian and was weak. And 2 things came into his mind, 2 true things. He was not the same. The plane passing changed him. The disappointment cut him down and made him new. He was not the same and would never be again like he had been. That was one of the true things, the new things. And the other one was that he would not die. He would not let death in again. He was new. Of course, he had made a lot of mistakes. He smiled now, walking up the lake shore after the wolves were gone, thinking of the early mistakes, the mistakes that came before he realized that he had to find new ways to be what he had become. He had made new fire, which he now kept going using partially rotten wood, because the punky wood would smolder for many hours and still come back with fire. But that had been the extent of doing things right for a while. His first bow was a disaster and almost blinded him. He had... Really? Come on. He had sat a whole night and shaped the limbs carefully until the bow looked beautiful. He had spent 2 days making arrows. The shafts were willow, straight, and with the bark peeled, and he had fire hardened the points and split a couple of them to make fork points, as he had done with the spear. He had no feathers, so he just left them bare, figuring for fish, they only had to travel a few inches. He had no string, and that threw him until he looked down at his tennis shoes. They had long laces, too long, and he found that one lace cut in half would take care of both shoes, and that left the other lace for a bowstring. All seemed to be going well until he tried a test shot. He put an arrow to the string, pulled it back to his cheek, pointed it at the dirt hummock, and at that precise instant, the bow wood exploded in his hand, sending splinters and chips of wood into his face. 2 pieces actually stuck into his forehead just above his eyes, and had they been only slightly lower, they would have blinded him. 2 stiff mistakes. In his mental journal, he listed them to tell his father, listed all of the mistakes. He had made a new bow with slender limbs and more fluid, gentle pull, but could not hit the fish though he sat in the water and was in the end surrounded by a virtual cloud of small fish. It was infuriating. He would pull the bow back, set the arrow just above the water, and when the fish was no more than an inch away, release the arrow, only to miss. It seemed to him that the arrow had gone right through the fish again and again, but the fish didn't get hurt. Finally, after hours, he stuck the arrow down in the water, pulled the bow, and waited for a fish to come close. And while he was waiting, he noticed that the water seemed to make the arrow bend or break in the middle. Of course, he had forgotten that water bends light. He had learned that somewhere in some class. Maybe it was biology. He couldn't remember, but it did bend light, and that meant fish were not where they appeared to be. They were lower, just below, which meant he had to aim just under them. He would not forget his first hit, not ever. A round-shaped fish with golden sides as gold as the sun, stopped in front of the arrow, and he aimed just beneath it at the bottom edge of the fish and released the arrow, and there was a bright flurry, a splash of gold in the water. He grabbed the arrow and raised it up, and the fish was on the end, wiggling against the blue sky. He held the fish against the sky until it stopped wiggling, held it, and looked to the sky, and felt his throat tighten, swell, and fill with pride at what he'd done. He had done food with his bow, with an arrow fashioned by his own hands. He had done food and had found a way to live. The bow had given him this way, and he exulted in it, in the bow, in the arrow, in the fish, in the hatchet, in the sky. He stood and walked from the water, still holding the fish and arrow and bow against the sky, seeing them as they fit his arms, as they were part of him. He had food. He cut a green willow fork and held the fish over the fire until the skin crackled and peeled away, and the meat inside was flaky and moist and tender. This he picked off 19 minutes, 27 seconds, carefully with his fingers, tasting every piece, mashing them in his mouth with his tongue to get the juices out of them, hot, steaming pieces of fish. He could not, he thought then, ever get enough. And all that first new day he spent going to the lake, shooting a fish, taking it back to the fire, cooking it and eating it, and then back to the lake, shooting a fish, cooking it and eating it. And on that way until it was dark. He had taken the scraps back to the water with the thought that they might work for bait, and the other fish came by the hundreds to clean them up. He could take his pick of them. Like a store, he thought, just like a store, and he could not remember later how many he ate that day, but he thought it must have been over 20. It had been a feast day, his first feast day, and a celebration of being alive and the new way he had of getting food. By the end of that day, when it became dark and he lay next to the fire with his stomach full of fish and grease from the meat smeared around his mouth, he could feel new hope building in him. Not hope that he would be rescued, that was gone, but hope in his knowledge, hope in the fact that he could learn and survive and take care of himself. Tough hope, he thought that night. I am full of tough hope. Okay, we are now at that finishes chapter 13. We are now going into chapter 14 on page 121 of Hatchet. I'd love to stop right now, but I got to get through this book, so I got to get through this book for Elena and anybody else that ever wants to watch this. So, okay, we got to go to page 128, and then that would be chapter 15, and that would go to 137. All right, let's see what we can do. The name of this chapter is Mistakes. Small mistakes could turn into disasters. Funny little mistakes could snowball so that while you were still smiling at the humor, you could find yourself looking at death. In the city, if he made a mistake, usually there was a way to rectify it, make it all right. If he fell on his bike and sprained a leg, he could wait for it to heal. If he forgot something at the store, he could find the other food in the refrigerator. Now it was different. It was also quick, also incredibly quick. If he sprained a leg here, he might starve before he could get around again. If he missed while he was hunting, or if the fish moved away, he might starve. If he got sick, really sick, so he couldn't move, he might starve. Mistakes. Early in the new time, he had learned the most important thing, the truly vital knowledge that drives all creatures in the forest. Food is all. Food was simply everything. All things in the forest, from insects to fish to bears, were always looking for food. It was a great single driving influence in nature, to eat, almost eat. But the way he learned it almost killed him. The second new night, stomach full of fish and the fire smoldering in the shelter. He had been sound asleep when something, he thought later, it might be smell, had awakened him. Near the fire, completely unafraid of the smoking coals, completely unafraid of Brian, a skunk. Ooh, a skunk was digging where he had buried the eggs. Ooh, that's no good. We got skunks around here, man. Skunks are gnarly. Smell burnt tire. Here they come and go. What's that little whiff? And you look on the ring cam, 2 a.m. in the morning, just like a family of 4 coming in, just hanging out in your backyard. Really? Yeah, skunks. Sorry, Brian. Okay. There was some sliver of a moon, and in the faint pearlite he could see the bushy tail, the white stripes down the back, and he had nearly smiled. He did not know how the skunk had found the eggs. Some smell, perhaps some tiny fragment of shell had left a smell, but it looked almost cute, a little head down and its little tail up as it dug, kicking the sand back. But those were his eggs, not the skunk's, and the half smile had been quickly replaced with fear that he would lose his food, and he had grabbed a handful of sand and thrown it at the skunk. "Get out of here," he says. "Get out of here, you kids." He was going to say more, some silly human words. Exactly. Some silly human words, but in less than half a second, the skunk had snapped its rear end up, curved the tail over and sprayed Brian with a direct shot aimed at his head from less than 4 feet away. No way, dude. That's crazy. In the tiny confines of the shelter, the effect was devastating. The thick, sulfurous, rotten odor filled the small room. Heavy, ugly, stinking. The corrosive spray that hit his face seared into his lungs and eyes, blinding him. Oh my God. He screamed and threw himself sideways, taking the entire wall of the shelter, screamed and clawed out of the shelter and ran into the shore of the lake. Stumbling and tripling, he scrambled into the water and slammed his head back and forth, trying to wash his eyes, slashing at the water to clear his eyes. 100 funny cartoons he had seen about skunks, cute cartoons about the smell of skunks, cartoons of Pepe Le Pew, cartoons to laugh at the joke and joke about, but when the spray hit, there was nothing funny about it. He was completely blind for almost 2 hours. A lifetime, he thought that he might be permanently blind, or at least impaired, and that would have been the end. As it was, the pain in his eyes lasted for days. Bothered him after that for 2 weeks. The smell in the shelter, in his clothes, and in his hair was still there now, almost a month and a half later. Damn. And he had nearly smiled. Mistakes. Food had to be protected. While he was in the lake trying to clear his eyes, the skunk went ahead and dug up the rest of the turtle eggs and ate every one. Licked all the shells clean and couldn't have cared less that Brian was thrashing around in the water like a dying carp. The skunk had found food and was taking it, and Brian was paying for a lesson. Protect food and have a good shelter. Not just a shelter to keep the wind and rain out, but a shelter to protect, a shelter to make him safe. The day after the skunk, he set about making a good place to live. The basic idea had been good. The place for his shelter was right, but he just hadn't gone far enough. He'd been lazy, but now he was the second most important thing about nature. What drives nature? Food was first, but the work for the food went on and on. Nothing in nature was lazy. He had tried to take a shortcut and paid for it with his turtle eggs, which he had come to like more than chicken eggs from the store. They had been fuller somehow and more depth to them. He set about improving his shelter by tearing it down. From dead pines up the hill, he brought down heavier logs and fastened several of them across the opening, wedging them at the top and burying the bottoms in the sand. Then he wove long branches in through them to make a truly tight wall, and still not satisfied, he took even thinner branches and wove them into the first weave. When he was at last finished, he could not find a place to put his fist through. It all held together like a heavy, stiff woven basket. He judged the door opening to be the weakest spot. And here he took special time to weave a door of willows in so tight a mesh that no matter how a skunk tried or porcupine, he thought, looking at the marks in his leg, it could not possibly get through. He had no hinges, but by arranging some cut off limbs at the top in the right way, he had a method to hook the door in place, and when he was in and the door was hung, he felt relatively safe. A bear, something big, could still get in by tearing at it, but nothing small could bother him, and the weave of the structure still allowed the smoke to filter up through the top and out. All in all, it took him 3 days to make the shelter, stopping to shoot fish and eat as he went, bathing 4 times a day to try and get the smell from the skunk to leave. When his house was finally done right, he turned to the constant problem, food. It was all right to hunt and eat or fish and eat. But what happened if he had to go for a long time without food? What happened when the berries were gone and he got sick or hurt or thinking of the skunk laid up temporarily? He needed a way to store food, a place to store it, and if he needed food to store, Mistakes. He tried to learn from the mistakes. He couldn't bury food again, couldn't leave it in the shelter because something like a bear could get at it right away. It had to be high, somehow high and safe, above the door up to the shelter, up the rock face. About 10 feet was a small ledge that could make a natural storage place, unreachable to animals, except that it was unreachable to him as well. A ladder, of course. He needed a ladder, but he had no way to fashion one, nothing to hold the steps on, and that stopped him until he found a dead pine with many small branches still sticking out. Using his hatchet, he chopped the branches off so that they stuck out 4 or 5 inches, all up along the log, and then he cut the log off about 10 feet long and dragged it down to his shelter. It was a little heavy but dry and he could manage it, and when he propped it up, he found he could climb to the ledge with ease, though the tree did not roll from side to side a bit as he climbed. His food shelf, as he thought of it, had been covered with bird manure, and he carefully scraped it clean with sticks. It's nasty. He had never seen birds there, but that was probably because the smoke from his fire went right up across the opening, and they didn't like smoke. Still, he had learned, and he took time to weave a snug door for the small opening with green willows, cutting it so it jammed in tightly. And when he finished, he stood back and looked at the rock face, his shelter below, the food shelf above, and allowed a small bit of pride to come. Not bad, he had thought, not bad for somebody who used to have trouble greasing bearings on his bicycle. Not bad at all. Mistakes. He had made a good shelter and food shelf, but he had no food except for fish and the last of the berries. And the fish, as good as they tasted then, were not something he could store. His mother had left some salmon out by mistake one time, and they went on an overnight trip to Cape Hesper to visit relatives, and when they got back, the smell filled the whole house. There was no way to store fish. At least, he thought, no way to store them dead. But as he looked at the weave of his structure, a thought came to him, and he moved down to the water. He had been putting the waste